Hello, everybody. I'm honored today to have again for the third time Sanjeev Sabhlok, a PhD, who is enjoying the early days of the early hours of February 7th, while I'm still stuck in February 6th. So technically, he can see the future living in Australia. How is February 7th, and how's it holding up for us? But moreover, tell us a little bit about what your work has been lately in talking about public health, the human mind, panic, so forth.
Yeah, so as you're aware, I've been discussing in the past. We've started a review of public health from first principles. That is to say, why does it exist, and so on. And in the process, I've come across a number of let's say false beliefs in the minds of people in general, public health in particular. For example, it was quite conclusively proven by the founders of public health, the sanitarians, that quarantine is extremely dangerous. They had done a cost-benefit analysis, Charles McLean, 200 years ago, etc. So there's a lot of stuff that was unknown to me. I thought this is all new stuff that I'm discovering. COVID, such a horrible policy performance, but actually it turns out that this was similar things that happened in the past. And so then here's another thing that nobody mentioned this anywhere. There's no literature on the subject anywhere. But as I was reading vast number of books and papers and stuff like that, I came across repeated instances of doctors going into panic. And if you look at the picture of the doctor the plague doctor, the mask that the doctor wears, well, that's a sign of panic. And these plague doctors were often found on top of windows administering whatever they administered to their patients far away. They would not go and touch the patients. They were terrified by these people. Most of them fled, which is another thing I found repeatedly mentioned in the literature. No one had drawn a kind of a generalization that this has actually happened everywhere. And then I found it's happened also during COVID. We have the dancing doctors, but we also had very early signs of doctors going into panic. I've actually identified many more of them in the past few months. Very early signs of doctors going into panic across the world, starting from Hong Kong and so on. So this wasn't definitely a public panic until the doctors first panicked. And then I was wondering, why do doctors panic so much? And then it turns out that there are very good reasons for them to panic. We have the nosocomial infection problem in standard general hospitals, where infection cannot easily be controlled. And therefore, 100,000 people die in the USA every year, for example, from infections that they catch inside hospital system. Doctors know that. They also are aware that there is very little that can protect them from a dangerous, lethal bug. For example, SARS was actually very lethal. And they are very aware of this and keenly. They are the most keenly aware and educated of all the people about the risks from these things. And so they have a tendency to sort of get the fear response. So initially I thought, this is all about fear. This is the limbic brain that's kicking in and that's causing these doctors to panic and so on. And then I did some other work, and I'll leave that for a moment. I'll stick to the panic issue, because then I sort of realized it's not just the doctors who panicked. It's the economists who panicked a hell of a lot. And so these, there are 265 economists wrote an open letter. Some of them are so eminent and so renowned in Australia. And I know one of them very personally. I've had lunch with a person, the very eminent person, economist. And I really had high respect for him. And he panicked like hell. And so these guys all panicked, and they demanded lockdowns. And we had Cass Sunstein. He's the guru of cost-benefit analysis, the absolute number one in the world. He worked with Obama in his office of whatever, management and so on, as the head of some regulatory policy. And so Cass Sunstein also panicked. And he cited some really crazy cost-benefit analysis that were conducted by some people in support of his ideas. Now, I can understand, it's quite reasonable to understand that, some people might panic, and the initial estimates of cost-benefit could be really crazy. But you would expect, Randall, that after some time, the same people would review the previous stuff, right? So the rational...
That's the eternal mystery. That's the essence of my Zika book, is that Zika microcephaly was a kind of a smaller pandemic, and it's more enclosed and it's smaller space. Never recurred, and nobody reformulated. It just seems like, sharks. They say in order to stay alive, have to keep moving forward. I don't know if
Yeah.
that's true or not about sharks,
Yeah.
but it may very well have an analogy, correctly or not, in the public health establishment. People just say stuff and then just move on.
Yeah, and so they have gone back. And here's the interesting thing: they did go back. Like Fauci initially was quite okay, saying some sensible stuff, and others, and then they went back and changed their mind against the masks and saying that lockdowns are important, etc. But then they did not review that. So they reviewed their allegedly previous position. In fact, as I mentioned, I think somewhere in the past that Fauci had actually stopped any possibility of quarantine for workers who came from Africa, dealing with Ebola. So he was out there publicly saying, no, we don't want quarantine of even the workers. There is absolutely no risk of these workers transmitting Ebola to anybody else, and so on. So he was quite okay on many of these issues for about till before he panicked. But the problem here with panic, and this is my definition of panic, Randall, you can test it if it's true. Panic is a state of mind when you do not review your decision. It's a position of dogmatism where you basically arrive at a final decision and you are completely unwilling to go back and review that. So Fauci had been talking sense for quite some time. Yeah, and he said, and he in fact wrote an article in February saying this is a pretty mild kind of a thing.
Right.
Don't panic.
He called the risk minuscule,
etc. And that is all sensible stuff. And then once he panicked, I think that's when I believe this is what happened. So I'm trying to figure out what went on in people's brains. Now there is a strategic and a rational and a public choice analysis of what might have happened in Fauci's mind, and that is he saw piles and piles of gold and diamonds in front of him if he followed the crowd, and therefore he would get more funding and he would get all this gold. And so, but the question is, an old man, I think he's about 80 something, and I myself am not attracted by gold, so who the hell is interested in more money? And so I'm just wondering, okay, so what went wrong? Was he driven by purely public choice stuff, which is self-interest, or was he driven by panic? Now,
well, okay, so I'm not saying I have the answer, but I did write a pretty comprehensive article on Dr. Fauci for Brownstone. It's called Dr. Fauci's Own Gain of Function. And I think some of it is, I don't know if you use the same colloquialism, CYA, which is cover your butt. I think there was, as COVID became a thing, I think he realized, or was made to realize by some of his compatriots, I mean, he might sign a lot of things as NIAID chief, and he signed up on a bunch of things. But I think it was coming home to roost that, in fact, he was complicit and the agency was complicit in the creation of this virus. And therefore, he went into what you can call it panic, but it's also maybe, dusting fingerprints. I mean, not dusting, removing your fingerprints from the crime scene. So I think there's that kind of panic. And I also think there was a separate, possible trove of not gold physically, but political gold. His wife is pretty much a even more kind of left-leaning political activist than he is. And I think this was an opportunity in the Nancy Pelosi sphere of getting the real virus, which is the interloper in the White House. I think it was a kind of a granulomatous response to the foreign body, which was Donald Trump. And so everything could be weaponized. So he could do, three things at once. He could, deal with his own irrationality, whatever, his own fear on a personal basis. He could cover his butt for all the complicity that the U.S. government was involved with through EcoHealth Alliance, Ralph Barrett, Peter Daszak, Wuhan, and so forth, and producing this literal gain of function virus for what purpose? Who knows? And then be able to take and convert that into total victory and incapacitate the economy, which was Trump's calling card to a second term. Everyone was pretty happy in early 2020, late 2019, and Trump has his rough edges, obviously, but nobody can argue that the unemployment rate was the lowest it had been in decades, and he had kind of mobilized the middle of the country. The opioid epidemic, people were talking about endlessly before that. It just stopped people talking. People just stopped talking about it because it declined because middle America had jobs, working class, blue collar people had jobs. And Trump was hugely successful on the domestic front, and he hadn't started any wars internationally. So, he was kind of, I'm not saying going to glide into a second term, but this was havoc. This was chaos. And it was all spread out there. And like any James Bond movie, they, threw, a bunch of nails and tacks on the road and watched the cars careen off and explode. And it was a very, I think, somewhat enjoyable episode for some people in politics. I actually have a point of proof for this, but I'm going to, stop talking for a little bit.
Yeah, look, I mentioned Fauci merely as an example, and I'm sure you've studied him like very intensively, which I have no particular, time to go into. But I'm looking forward, as I said, I was reading vast amount of historical material, right? So.
Mhm.
And I'm looking for patterns. I'm looking for things that are common across hundreds and hundreds of years of pandemic. Okay,
Mhm.
so for me, this is a more of a theoretical question, isolated completely from the COVID issue, which is I've been mentioning again many times that I'm sort of interested in COVID, but I'm not really looking at COVID anymore because I've looked at it quite considerably,
Mhm.
with Gigi Foster and others, and I've written a book on it. So at this moment, I'm looking at what drives these whole thing. What makes these like Zika? What makes it so big? Finally, yes, the WHO went out saying, that this will people should stop having babies or something like that. So basically, some really senior people across the world went into panic as well. And then, of course, God knows how many children didn't happen because of that panic. So harms can be of many kinds. They can be direct harms of people like they were in lockdowns, and they can be indirect harms of that sort. Panic is very harmful. The point I'm making is that panic in general is very harmful, and there are tens and tens of instances in history. So whether a particular individual it's almost like a statistical regularity, which is what I found. And as you know, statistical regularity does not predict an individual case. So I cannot guarantee from this theory that Fauci either went into panic or he had the other issues going on. It's not possible. It's impossible to untangle. For an
Mhm.
individual patient, for example, it's virtually impossible in most cases to untangle the direct cause
Mhm.
of any particular. Statistically, you can say there are a lot of things that could have caused a person's cholesterol or whatever, heart disease or something. But individually, it's very hard. So same thing here, that statistically, I find overall that pandemics cause panics, but there are certain clauses here. Uh, Not all pandemics cause panic. Not all pandemics cause panics, which is very important. And even during a panic, not all places panic. So we have good counter examples in the Spanish flu. Indeed, there were a few small parts of USA and a few parts of Australia that did panic here and there, but very sporadic. But overall, there was no panic at all in Spanish during the Spanish flu. It's been noted quite extensively by Gary Becker, the great economist, and so on. Many others have acted surprised, saying the Dow Jones didn't budge. In fact, it went up. It went down slightly for about 1 or 2%, and then it went up. There was nothing of the sort that happened during COVID. So, and why? And there's a lot of discussion in the literature about why people didn't panic during Spanish flu. And one of the key reasons, and I was reading the writings of the head of the Surgeon General or whatever of USA, the head of public health. I don't know what he's, but that kind of a person was writing, and very calm kind of a paper written in 1921 or something. And I've cited that in my paper. But overall, the chiefs of the health system, did not panic. Second, the country was involved in war. They were very much focused on war, and they didn't want to panic the country in any case. So more or less the country in the USA and in Australia as well, they went on more or less in the same normal pace, except a few panics here and there. The other counterexample is Sweden, where the chief of the health system calmed the country down, and therefore they didn't panic. So we have an example right in front of our
Still
nose.
1918 we're talking about, correct?
No, we are talking about 2020,
Okay.
where during COVID, where the whole world went into panic, the Swedish people were pretty calm and relaxed. And I've seen videos of those guys going around their normal business, yes, there were a few changes to their lifestyles, but the panic wasn't there. And so what actually causes harm? So during Spanish flu, there was virtually no change to the GDP of USA. In fact, the GDP increased, I think, by 0.2% or something. A slight bump, but it did not go down, whereas it went down dramatically in COVID. So panic harms us in many ways. And so the question then is, why does it happen in some places and not in others? What could be driving the panic? And so that's the kind of puzzle, and very little literature. Public health, which should have actually been on top of this issue, because pandemics is where all these things occur. Economics, by the way, there have been financial panics, all this tulip mania and other few things, and depression, etc. So there have been studies on financial panics, but nobody has linked it with the human brain, with the human brain, so which is very interesting. So they're trying to study the panic mathematically, and that doesn't really work. It's a chaos theory kind of thing. It doesn't really tell us much. What really we need to understand is why these things happen. And so I think that's where I come out with the theory. Then it sort of, because economists, what is rationality? As I said, to me, rationality versus panic, there only is one difference. During panic, you become dogmatic. You don't review your decision. What's rationality? That I don't know anything. I'm just going to review and check, and every day I'm going to improve. So it's like I'm an open-ended person, right? I keep on changing and improving. Yeah, it's like a student going to class. When you are in class in school, you don't say that I finished knowing everything. You don't say that I know everything. Every day you go, you learn something, you change your mind, you improve. That's rationality, right? Rationality is about continuous improvement, and this is where panic is the exact opposite. Panic eliminates rationality. It eliminates this key element of review of previous decisions. When I started looking at that, then I said, okay, my God, this is telling me something more deeper than I thought. This is actually not just telling me about the problem of panics. It's telling me about the problem of the human brain and the assumption of rationality. And then I studied, and it turns out that all the thinkers of rationality have been people who had no clue about the human brain. People like Aristotle said, man is the only rational animal. He sits there 2,500 years ago, says, man is the only rational animal. Well, sorry, Aristotle, he thought that it's not the brain, but the heart that does the thinking. The brain is simply there to cool the heart. The man had no clue about the human body. Then you go to Mises in the early 20th century, 1930s, and he's busy writing man is a rational animal and all that stuff. Very good, excellent. But Mises has no clue about the human brain, because the triune brain model only arose in the 1960s, late 60s. So we're talking of knowledge that wasn't there. So these people were making their assumptions about rationality and the Enlightenment and all those stuff. It's all based on rationality, right? Much of it, not the romanticism, but much of rationality is. Enlightenment is deeply intertwined with the concept of rationality. But we find that these people didn't really know the human brain. And so we're still discovering the human brain. As I said just before we started, I was just reading this article of 2022, which makes it clear that the human brain is quite unique, because we have got deep linkages between the limbic brain and the frontal lobe. And these deep linkages cause feedback loops and panics and other things, which, of course, this paper didn't mention, but that's what I'm looking at in the psychiatric literature. Literature of psychiatry is very clear that. So I, by the way, studied the psychiatry quite intensively at one part of my, not psychiatry, I would say abnormal psychology and psychology as part of my civil service exam. So I was very, deeply involved in studying abnormal psychology for some time. And then this particular idea, linking abnormal psychology with the brain, has been attempted by psychiatry for quite some time. And they've come out with a few hints here and there, which I thought became very clear now, that the reason why humans panic is because we imagine a lot of things. So once we imagine a lot of things, and so I was just thinking about belief systems. So, when a child is born, my understanding is that the child is told certain things and models of, existence by their parents. In the models of existence, somebody might say there's a bunjil, in Aboriginal culture, there's a bunjil. Somebody might say there's a tortoise, and somebody might say there is this and that. And the child then imagines all that stuff. The human brain imagines all that stuff, right? And then we are linking all that with the death. So somebody dies in the family, and so over the course of many years, that model gets embedded, because when somebody dies in an Aboriginal culture, or I'm using the Aboriginal just as an example, but you can consider it, Christian culture, Muslim culture, Hindu culture, the same thing. So over the course of time, these imaginary concepts, which are painted in the minds of the human being, a child, no other animal can do that. These models of painted in the head, they become real as the limbic brain gets kicked in. So when somebody dies, my father died last, a year and a half ago. And so at that point, a lot of emotions kick into your head. Okay. And so you go there and there's a ceremony, and then in our case, there's a cremation ceremony and whatnot. I'm fairly objective. I call myself hyper rational, which is a problem because I don't think there are too many hyper rational people, which is basically looking at it from completely, I don't know what level. But the point is, you got to be take yourself away from the event. So I do that all the time. And I was, putting the ashes here, or doing all the formalities which my mother wanted and others wanted in the family and so on. And there was this, but you can really see over the course of a lifetime, you get embedded into a certain belief system. And then you do not go and review. You don't go and ask your, grand uncle or whatever, who is Bunjil? Bunjil, by the way, is the eagle who created the world according to the Aborigines. You don't go and ask, say, where the hell is Bunjil? Or, in the case of a tortoise, where's the tortoise? Or where is the evidence of this or that? You don't go and do that. You're embarrassed. And so I think that the review, you stop reviewing. So this part of the brain, which is really important, that is the only unique human phenomena that I've identified so far. No other animal has it. The link between the limbic brain and the frontal lobe, and the cycles that happen, the repeat cycles, and finally the brain shuts off. And I didn't even think that the brain could shut off. I was speculating that the brains of these economists have probably shut off, because I can't think of it. Why did they not review their decisions? I went last year to Sydney and met a lot of economists. I presented the cost-benefit analysis that I had done with Gigi Foster at that Economics Association meeting, right? Very few people attended my thing. They knew what I'm talking about. A couple of them are, engaged after the thing. I actually met all the senior officials of the government in New South Wales, Australia, explained to them how it's done. There was no interest. So no one's trying to review this. Even after COVID is long gone, no one is showing any interest. What's going wrong with these guys? And so then the question is slightly deeper. It's okay to understand that somebody might panic, but the question is, why did the brain shut down and remains shut down? That's the second empirical fact that we've observed, that people are not reviewing what they said or did during that COVID period. I know a few people who did review, which is great, but there are very few of them, and that too, they didn't probably, like Piers Morgan, he said sorry about some of the things he said, and so there are a few people who like that who did review, which is great, but most people have not reviewed. And that, I think, is the reason why we need to study panic. And rationality is linked in automatically. The fact that we are not a rational animal, we are the only irrational animal. This is the other part that I have found. Yeah.
Well, I think some of the issue is that individually, playing a game of chess or something like that, you can be fairly rational. You can try to deduce the right move, maybe come up with it. So whether you get to measure yourself against other chess players, et cetera, on an individual basis. However, chess is a game of war. The actual game of war called war, we can't do by ourselves. We can't, we have very fleshy, vulnerable places. We get older. We're not as fast as young people. Young people tend to be a little bit more aggressive. We don't want to, set them off. I can be the smartest guy in the room or something like that, or if it's a very small room, and very few people in it. But, I don't want to mess with somebody who, say, is not rational, who's going to take advantage of any particular situation or grievance and punch me in the face. That kind of thing has happened. In fact, when I was a medical intern, so quite some time ago, I was walking home after a long night awake and treating people and helping the world, say, potentially, and, getting sick people, try to get them better, or at least moving them around one way. At any rate, I'm walking home, and there's a little parade, kind of not a holiday. It's called the Freddie Fixer Parade in New Haven. And I don't know who Freddie Fixer was, or whether he's just a thing or whatever, but it was kind of a community thing. And I'm just walking on the street, and just out of nowhere, this guy just punches me right in the face. It was a totally random thing. I'd have to think back what set him off, but I hadn't engaged because I just wanted to walk home. I was like, tunnel vision, and I didn't touch him or anything like that. Maybe somebody else did, and he turned and thought it was. I have no idea, but I got clocked, and that can happen on a random basis, and it can happen on any other kind of basis. So we have kind of an innate sense of wanting to get away from that. So a lot of you can be the Descartes or Voltaire or Einstein or whatever, but guess what? You still have fleshy parts, and somebody can take advantage of you on the subway, bus or train or whatever, and then you're done. You're no longer. I think was Marie Curie's husband, Pierre Curie. He got hit by like a milk cart or something like that on a street when cars weren't even going that fast. And he's done. So we have this threat that things could just turn haywire really quickly, and even if you don't die, you might be quadriplegic, you might lose some teeth, whatever. So we have. I think it still is somewhat rational to have a sense of fear of the unknown and fear of situations, and try to be protected as much as we can. To the extent that you're going to take this beyond your own fleshy little self and impose it on society to protect your own fleshy little self, that's where things go awry, and that's where it becomes really an overweening kind of like a power play for somebody who's fleshy like me. Say Dr. Fauci went to medical school like me. He's probably reasonably an intellect and whatnot, smart enough kind of guy, to take that and put it to some kind of weird twist and advantage. That's when things get perverse. I'm not sure it's panic per se, or manipulation, or power hunger, whatever. It may not just be money, in the sense of your bank account, but it's some kind of social, personal, political capital that people are getting, and they're getting applauded one way or another. And this tends to be a group phenomenon because we are fleshy individuals. Collectivism. I was reading a great post by a friend of mine today. People are always wondering why communism never really goes away. It's because some of the ideas, the concept. I mean, it's a terrible system. It never works. It always leads to slavery. But the concepts of it, kind of ring true to us. We're all together. We're all going to be working together, and people want that. They may not want communism. They might want communitarianism, some kind of community to be together, because individualism, libertarianism is probably a better, more rational concept, but people can't do it. It's very lonely. Libertarians are lonely, and people like to be in groups, and they like to have people, have a beer with. They like to be in a crowd. They like to be yelling and screaming for Taylor Swift.
Well, you've raised a lot of issues and a lot of interesting points. I think regarding libertarian, this point has been raised quite a lot. Are libertarians more individualistic, and so they do not have beer with others? And I'm not sure, because I think even Hayek had mentioned somewhere that actually, or even Adam Smith had mentioned, quite extensively, model sentiments and so on, that we enjoy each other's company, but a social animal, everybody agrees with that. So I think the point that you've raised is about shifting the burden of your fears onto others. You've raised a number of points. One of them is that. So let me write that down. I'll give an example, Walter Block. Okay. The other point that you mentioned is actually the one I'm trying to distinguish quite specifically. The rational fear versus irrational panic. So I'm trying to distinguish them very sharply. That's why I call all animals rational, except human beings. So it's quite rational. Rationality, as I've identified and I've confirmed, is basically nothing but evolutionary fitness. So if you want to be a fit animal in your environment, you better survive. The survival is the first step. So that's where the limbic brain comes in. It's got the burden to make sure the animal survives. And so if someone punches you in the face, or some other a threat emerges, a rational observable threat, or that's something that can be predicted reasonably, you should take steps against that, and that's rational. The problem with the human being that I'm identifying, Randall, is that we also have a vast number of irrational fears. So we are the only animal that can imagine things that don't exist, that fears. So with COVID, it was everywhere, right to the very end. And even till today, I think that it is the next big thing after the Spanish flu. Never before in 100 years have we had such a thing. This claim was made repeatedly, and I have refuted it repeatedly, but didn't go into anybody's head. The problem here is not the need for us to be cautious in the face of pandemics. Of course, you should be cautious. Nobody's saying you take risks unnecessarily. The issue is really that if you go overboard, number one, you go overboard. Number two, you don't review your decision. And number three, like you said, you start imposing your views on other people. Walter Block is a libertarian, is one of the most important libertarians of our time. And I admire a lot of his work, and I've followed him very closely for many, many decades now. And he went overboard and said that people who don't take a vaccine, the COVID vaccine, they should be hung and killed, basically hung. Basically, they should be hanged. And he said that people who are elderly, they should be put under house arrest and stopped from getting outside their house for their own benefit, right? So imagine this is a libertarian, okay? So when we look at the leading libertarian of our time, I think Herman Hans Hoppe is number one, probably close to number one or two. Then I haven't followed Herman's views at this point in time, but Walter Block is really the number one, unequivocally the biggest libertarian of our time. And he starts imposing his views, and he demands, on the basis of some really convoluted rationality arguments, which is rationalizations for his fears. So the problem here we have been discussing, which I'm trying to identify, is a universal problem. So what I'm trying to say is, what are the universal things that we can identify from the patterns of panics, from the nature of the human brain? And so what can we expect in the future? So my question is, it's quite okay for us to study COVID and, to write more about it. And so, in fact, I was arguing with the Collateral Global people in London that, hey, you're studying more and more COVID. They're starting some more research on COVID. And I'm saying, hey, okay, by all means do that. But if you have any general scientific interest, you would want to know, what is the problem with public health? What is the problem with economics that, so many economists have been supportive of this thing? What's the problem with law that so many lawyers like Cass Sunstein have supported these totalitarian policies? What's the problem with what's the underlying problems that are causing this thing? Obviously there's when a volcano erupts, you just don't say, okay, that's erupted, let's study that volcano. No, you study the underlying magma. You study the tectonics. You study a little bit deeper. You go deeper so that you know that the volcanoes are an inevitable part of our existence. Likewise, panics are a part of our existence, and we need to know. One other thing that I want to emphasize, and that's why I'm writing a little book for economists, which could be potentially used by other disciplines, is basically I would like young economists, to be very deeply aware of their own tendency to panic. For economists who come out, in Los Angeles, when you go to the classes and you go to the seminars of economics, you get very confident professors and you get very confident, young students. They go to the blackboard, all the maths, all the equations, blah, 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 blah. They come out with some recommendations and they go home thinking they've achieved wonderful things. Well, that's all based on the assumption of rationality. And it's quite reasonable, as I keep arguing in my paper, in the book that I'm writing, it's quite reasonable to actually use that assumption as the first approximation. It's like Newton's law of gravity. By all means, in engineering, you should use that. You should definitely use the Newton's laws rather than worry about the general theory of gravity, of relativity. So what I would like economists to be aware of, however, is that that's not the end of it. They cannot, with that rational choice model, they cannot predict their own behavior during panics of this sort that occurred. They cannot even explain religion, for that matter. They can't explain a million things. They can't really explain why art exists, or why modern art exists, or why something else. They can say, yes, people prefer this and prefer that, but why does it exist in the first place? Why does it not exist in the other part of the animal kingdom? And so that's where I would like them to integrate the discipline with biology. Now, Kahneman and Tversky had tried their best over the course of time, and I have their book sitting somewhere. Let's leave it. I'll search for it later. The thinking slow, thinking fast, or whatever. That and their work has a system 1, system 2 thinking. They've tried to integrate a little bit of that into economics with biases and rational biases. And Timur Kuran's availability heuristic, and he was my teacher in USC in LA. And so there are these people who've been working in that space, but they've not really gone deep into the human biology. They've not gone as deep as I think we need to go in order to understand our limitations as human beings. So the doctor who comes out, he should not just know the Hippocratic Oath, in my view. He should know that he's vulnerable to panic. He should remember the mask. The first thing they should put is the mask of the panic doctors, of the plague doctor. That's the first thing they should put on a doctor when he enters the medical school. Because
so specifically, what mask are you talking about during the plague? Like, what was that?
Okay, I'll show you the one. I've got it somewhere. This is the one. Let me. I can't share it with you. It's the one with a beak. You
Yes.
Remember? The one wearing a hat and the beak, and a stick in the front, and they would not touch anybody, but they'd use the stick. So this was the mask that was used right through the plague by doctors. The ones who stayed, almost all of them fled. That's the other thing that they should realize, that doctors should realize that they have continuously. And by the way, I've listed so many instances in the recent 20th century of doctors fleeing whenever there's a little bit of a so-called pandemic, particularly in Africa. There's so many instances of doctors fleeing from the Ebola and stuff like that. So have I lost you?
No, I'm still here.
I can't see you.
I'm just trying to pull this up so people can see.
Yeah, you can talk about the Black Plague doctor's mask, and somewhere in Google it'll show you.
So I was unaware that's what that was. That the mask. What was the point of the beak on the mask?
They had all sort of stuff inside the thing. They had all sorts inside the beak. If I'm not mistaken, they had all sorts of powders and few absorption materials so that they were protecting the nose. They had stuff inside the beak. Okay, yeah, this is the one. So this beak, as you got and study why the National Geographic thing is there. That's a good one to go to. That'll give you the full story. But the point that I want to say, this is actually an integrated part of the medical science. The plague doctor is not something that sits in isolation of more modern science. It is telling us about the underbelly of our species, which has only been discovered in the last, I would argue, in the last 10 years or so. With Kahneman's work and a few others, System 1, System 2. Now you go into the recent paper that I found where actually they've started studying they're basically doing brain scans, right? They're studying what lights up when you have a particular sense of panic or whatever. They're studying the brain, and that brain studies are only happening now. So medical science should, I think, study panic, and they should be, and every doctor should be very, very clearly made aware that they will panic, that they are going to experience panic in the face of death. And the death, what I call the death singularity, is something which is inevitable. Like you said, we are made of flesh, and the doctor experiences that first before anybody else. If doctors become more familiar with this idea of panic, what do we really want them to do? What do I think that they should do? Or do as I said, they should go and review their old decision. I don't care if anybody panics today. It doesn't matter. But I do care if they continue to panic after 3 years. It's a problem for humanity if our most intelligent people do not review their old decisions. So they stick with their panic and panic-based beliefs. So I think that's the kind of thing that I hope to get out of this exercise, that there'll be more focus on study of panic as we understand the human brain better. We also understand that we are the only irrational animal. I think that's one of the most important things that I've discovered, which I don't think anybody else has mentioned anywhere in the literature, that humans are the only irrational animal. The only unique.
I remember you're saying that. So I would push back on that slightly. I was looking through your Twitter feed, and
yes,
I
go for it.
I saw you mentioning this. So you have animals are extremely rational. Buddha had the luxury of his delusions because he could pass on his fantasies to working people who would then feed him. Ours is the only species which feeds its deluded fellow members, who produce no food. The gurus, artists, poets, novelists, movie makers, and singers. So, I appreciate what you're saying, that it's certainly not necessarily rational to do that. But we have this thing called luxury or leisure time, which other animals don't. Aside from, say, our domestic pets and or domesticated animals, one form or another, for food and so forth. But animals in the wild, they live under parsimony. There's just a certain number of raccoons that the forest can support, and you want to be one of those raccoons. There's only just enough food, or else the place will be overrun with raccoons. So the raccoons are competing not just with other animals; they're competing with other raccoons essentially to get things that raccoons like to find, the place that raccoons like to live, and so forth. And they're breeding at the same time, so they have to be producing more of them. They have to get some food for their young. There's a lot of pressure to be a raccoon, and they don't get to read the Wall Street Journal. They don't get to do have any savings. They don't have any refrigerators. They don't have any kind of recourse, vacations, or anything like that. It's they're a raccoon every single day for as long as they get to be one, whether it's on 4 or 5 years or whatever it is. And the animal lifetimes tend to be usually in the single digits of life. Whatever, if you're bigger, maybe you get away with something else. But those animals, they there are a certain number of deer because a certain number of grass, a certain amount of grass. And there are other animals competing. Anyway, there's an endless competition, and they don't get to move beyond it. I let a dog live with me, or vice versa. A dog lets me live with him. I don't think my dog, albeit domesticated, is necessarily cognitively different from a dog, a few thousand years ago. We may not be cognitively different either. However, the difference between, say, an ancient Roman's dog and my dog is probably very little as far as what they know and don't know. And the difference between even if physiologically we're similar, you and an ancient Roman, there's an amount of things that we know that are different, and the amount of ways we can. Maybe ancient Rome is not a good example because they had civilization. But if you get somebody in the wild, someplace, an Aboriginal, say in Papua New Guinea, even a couple hundred years ago, they are living on the same kind of level potentially as the animal. They're living under nature's parsimony, and they have some civilization potentially. They've made some poison darts and this and that. But if you go far enough back before there's much in the way of technology for that human, you're going to live on a subsistence level. You don't have the time to do all this philosophy. You don't need novelists. You don't need music. Maybe you can hum something in your head. But this kind of secondary order, tertiary. I mean, even in the last 120 years, the number of hours we have for leisure has, I think, more than doubled, maybe tripled even, potentially as well, because we have longer life expectancies and so forth. So we have a lot of this weird time where we can binge on movies and games and all this kind of stuff, and our ideas they go far afield. So the rationality, we may very well be as rational as tigers and as rational as raccoons or gophers. We just don't have to be, and we've been taken away from all this. It's almost like a pampered, fat domestic cat doesn't have to be anything like a lion or a panther out in the wild. They have totally different exigencies.
Well, that's all very interesting, and but I still stick with my arguments, and I'll explain why. For example, as you mentioned, the Aboriginals from Papua New Guinea, and I've actually been to Adelaide recently, and there's a massive museum which has artifacts from Papua New Guinea, and they're quite amazing crafts and other things that they have produced. But the more important thing that I was referring to is that humans, even in those societies, even in the ancient tribal societies, they actually created a niche for people that did not produce anything. So all other animals go and have to, they have to kill, they have to do other things to eat, etc. These humans, however, we managed to have people whose only specialization is imagination. They have these, medicine men and creators of mythologies and the gurus or whatever you call them. And they actually become more eminent. The ones who create writing and other such notations and symbols and art, painting on the walls and other things. We actually managed to create a subspecies of humans that do not work like produce, dig up food or kill any animal, etc., for survival. We managed to have people surviving out of their imagination, which is true today. Taylor Swift is nothing but imagination. She goes out there with $1 billion, song or whatever, and people are just staying there and living in a world of imagination with some music. So this is quite uniquely human, right? So what I'm saying is, this is actually the only animal. We are the only animal that can sort of live off our imagination. And by the way, I, as a knowledge worker, pretty much do the same thing. I have a kitchen garden, but I don't go around killing animals and most of us don't. So, right. So we have reached a point where we live off our imagination, our innovation, our creativity, our songs, our art and culture and novels and movies. This is humans, spirituality, the gurus of India. I mean, we basically have very few people who actually do some work and produce food for us. So survival for us is not a problem. As you rightly said, we managed to create, because of the imagination, by the way, as I said, it's a great boon. It's a great gift to us to have this imagination, because with that, like a raccoon is limited with the amount of food that it can create within the environment. The human is not limited. No, Malthus was wrong. He thought we are like animals and we can't therefore produce more food. He's completely wrong, right? We can keep on producing more and more and more food from nothing. We are basically that good. Our mind is that innovative and imaginative. So innovation is the one side of this of our irrationality. That's completely irrational. There is nothing that is found in any animal comparable to that. On the other side, the flip side of that is our panic, our death singularity, our fears, which are exaggerated fears. I'm not talking of rational fear, right? So I've distinguished earlier rational fear versus the panic. Rational fear is quite okay. All animals have a rational fear. They know they get terrified with something and then the thing is gone and they're relaxed. Humans don't do that. We are terrified of COVID, whether it's it exists we have a mask, we go here, we do this. We just imagine a lot of things in our head. So we have a positive side of our imaginary stuff, imaginations, and we have a negative side. And these two combined is what I call irrationality. I'm not just saying irrationality in a negative sense. I've actually identified, if you notice, I've also mentioned on Twitter, it suddenly struck me that all innovation and creation and creativity is actually irrational. There is no automatic. So we can imagine a creator. He will create, we always say that innovation is, you have tens of ideas and one of them will work. Well, why did you think of those wrong ideas in the first place? They were irrational. Well, it's only because we thought those irrational ideas that one of them will work. No other animal can do that. We can think a lot of things. We can imagine all sorts of. So the creation story, the mythologies around creation of mankind, there are millions of them, practically millions. Go to India itself, every village will have its own mythology. They'll have a little god they found in a pond, or they have a little rock and they put a couple of dots of paint on that and then they worship that. There are millions and millions of mythologies about how humans came and where we're going and what's going to happen to us after we die and blah, blah, blah. So who else can do that except us, Randall? Who else can do that? That's why I think the theory of rationality needs to be modified and say we are the only rational animal, but we are also rational. And that rationality that we have is very superior to all other animals because the power of our frontal lobe is so huge. We can actually create the most amazing things, right? So, but the problem is if we don't recognize our irrationality as the foundational, characteristic as an animal. The foundational thing is irrational. If we don't recognize that, then what we get is what we had with the COVID. We have economists writing out, we want this whole thing to shut down. Doctors saying shut down. Thousands of doctors wrote, and they never go back. I think that's the problem. If they had gone back, I would say, yeah, they made a mistake. No problem. They're rational.
That's the whole thing, admitting your mistakes. So Jeffrey Tucker started Brownstone, and he's a libertarian, and he was hugely disappointed. The reason he started it is because the mass of libertarians were just kind of cowering, and they just tossed their libertarianism away.
Says, hang all these guys who don't take a vaccine. That's what he wrote.
All this stuff didn't make much sense. It's just kind of a sadness. So we're kind of rounding out the hour here. I'd like to hear what your prospective ideas and projects are going to be. How accessible will your theories be for hoi polloi, regular people? What's the actionable item that you can bring, and have you had success to date in doing that? You say people's minds are not going to be changed per se. If we understand, the reason we presumably have fire drills, and the reason a lot of us learn CPR is that it's a very shocking, scary situation as it happens. So if you're in the military, they drill you endlessly on getting your gun out, what you have to
Yes.
do,
How to
and
prepare,
it's
how to
this
prepare.
muscle memory thing.
Mm,
And so it's like riding a bike. At some point, you know how to do. You know what they have to do.
okay.
You know, can we have this kind of not a panic drill per se, but a drill that will teach us that we are panicable as a society,
That's the
which I
word,
think, mind
panicable.
you, I want to make the distinction, is different from individual panic oftentimes.
Yes, absolutely. I think we're talking statistical regularities here. We're talking systems designed to accommodate this, this negative side of our irrationality. So by calling humans irrational, I'm praising them, because we are the only creature that can create this little, this computer that can talk across the world, right? So we are quite unique in that sense. However, we have a little bit of a weakness and a gap. So I think the gap needs to be identified before we, uh, you know, uh, what I'm saying is that lockdown problem can't be solved. So the more and more I go inside the lockdown problem, the quarantine problem, the vaccine mandate problem, the mask mandate problem, I don't think it can be solved, because everywhere I read, people who are promoting these ideas, they actually are still in a state of panic, and you can feel it. You can feel it when you go to the Twitter and you see someone sharing a requirement for a mask and this and that. You can sense that, hey, this guy's Devi Sridhar is a good example. I keep on citing her name as a doctor who is so badly panicked. I just can't even imagine how anybody could panic so much. But there are people who have panicked dramatically. Now, we obviously are not in the business of trying to fix everybody's panic.
Too bad.
What we are in a business of is, as rational human beings, and by the way, this is called hyper rationality, which is, I believe rationality is very important. I believe in understanding ourselves is very important. So I think what we need to do is to understand ourselves, and therefore prepare ourselves for a situation when we have panicked as a society. And so what is a drill that we go through at that time? And one of the first things I would say, like I was saying it many times earlier, but nobody heard, and I think I'll say it again, is a cost benefit analysis should be conducted instantly by the government or whatever, and it should be reviewed every 1 or 2 weeks. We don't want comprehensive cost benefit analysis. We want information that's coming in to flow into the to the cost benefit analysis or whatever. We want everybody to have one single word when they say. So when our Prime Minister in Australia, Scott Morrison, goes up on the television on the 18th of March 2020 and claims that this is once in a 100-year pandemic, he should always have a proviso saying, this is what I think at the moment, and I'll come back to you after I review this thing. We need to have, in fact, Eamon Matheson, a doctor, a wonderful doctor from Melbourne, who also started a COVID network of some sort in Melbourne, and he, by the way, got suspended for that, but or something like that. I don't know whether he got suspended. I met him a number of times as well. So one of his first writings in I think it's September 2020 was that we should review these things that we are doing. There should be a process to go back and start a review of what we're doing. If we do not review, so I think the first thing would be, please review your previous decision. Do not continue with your previous decision.
Right.
That I think these kind of systematic, system-based, potential answers. And of course, I won't go into detail with the other one. We got to close. The isolation hospital system that I proposed. It's very big. It's very problematic. It can be, potentially harmful. I would not recommend a thing which is harmful. So I'd say keep it on the table as an option, where can we provide doctors with sufficient assurance that they don't panic. Okay. One of the problems with doctors, and I look at doctors and I go to them, I've met them in many of them in India, they're doing their work, and I met them here, is that they're very busy, right? A doctor gets up in the morning, goes straight to work, comes back late, is exhausted, he or she, and they don't have time to review anything that's going on. So if they have managed to imbibe a belief that makes them panic, there is nothing in the system that will unpanic them. So how do we unpanic a doctor who's panicked? And I think that's the question mark. Maybe give them some assurance that, maybe have more Anders Tegnells. maybe we generate more people like him who are calm and relaxed and other things. So I don't know, but Randall, this is a human problem. This is not a COVID issue. This is not a Fauci issue. This is a very fundamental issue of our biology. And I think the better we understand, the better we think of ways to deal with this issue. Okay, so that's what I'm coming to. Hopefully, in terms of communication, I'm just writing stuff. I really don't care about who reads what. I'm here, as I said, I'm driven by the need to understand the world. Okay, I've been doing it since I was very, very young. I've got tons of materials and writings and readings. I never come to a final answer, which is a big problem. I continuously come to tentative answers, and I continuously go back and change my answers. Quite so. I'm a very bad communicator because I don't have a final answer. So I will keep on till I live. That's my plan. Keep on doing what I do. And whether it makes any difference to anybody is not my business. It's my business to really understand. And that's all I care for.
Well, appreciate that. Well, thank you, Sanjeev. I want to let people be able to follow you, or at least learn about you and learn from you. So you are on Twitter, X, here, and you have the book we mentioned earlier on Amazon, The Great Hysteria and the Broken State. And I assume there are some other books as well from your
the
office.
one with Foster, and I've written a book on India. And there's a lot of manuscripts out there, which I actually found that the practice of writing a book is very painful because a lot of editing is required. I don't like to edit. I don't like to go back to what I've written. And so therefore, I'm just pouring out material on the internet, lots and lots of it, that 1 million words on the internet already, which are not in the form of a book and might never. I've written a book on critical thinking, for example, for children, a book on economics for children, which is, by the way, praised by Vernon Smith, the Nobel Prize winner in economics. I've been writing and pouring out stuff. I really don't believe in publishing books in a formal manner. It's too much of a time waste. I don't have much time in this life to go on editing books.
I understand that. But it's useful. A lot of people maybe be able to take some of the things you talk about. I like, we spoke last time about your first ever first principles review of public health. So I recommend people go back and look at that. I'll try to cite that in some of the notes on this post. Maybe you can do that as well. So that's Sanjeev Sabhlok. Follow him on Twitter, buy his book. And just as a last word for myself,
yes.
This is my book. We kind of referenced it earlier, Returning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was, the Panic That Certainly Was. If you take away the DEM in the middle, you get panic. And so there hasn't been any reformulation or reconsideration, even though it's been quite some time now, a total of going on 8 years, that Zika has not caused any increase in microcephaly. And the only time it ever did was late 2015, ostensibly, but that was at a time when they had 0 Zika tests on Earth, because Zika heretofore had been a harmless, basically a tiny version of the 4 dengue viruses and one little tiny Zika one that's not really a human virus. And dengue never caused microcephaly. There was no microcephaly registry. You've heard of this before, but maybe not everyone has. And they went with that. And even in 2016, the following year, they didn't find any increase in microcephaly anywhere, including Northeast Brazil. And it's still a thing. Billions of dollars get thrown at it. They're coming up with a vaccine. The vaccine is going to be promulgated. The dengue vaccine, which exists, has caused problems for people. And this will be basically another dengue vaccine because Zika is a dengue. That's the 5th dengue. And there's not going to be any benefit. So risk-benefit implies there's some risk. And so you can't really have much benefit unless there's actually any risk. They haven't really proved the risk. And nobody will talk about this because, my conspiracy theory is because there's going to be some cash to be made in the production and then the continual production of a Zika vaccine, after which they'll announce they cured it. No, so, people don't see Zika microcephaly anymore. Yay, we did a great job. But in fact, there was no real problem there in the first place. So my job is to head it off the pass insofar as I can. So if you hear this, try to contact your public health authorities and or me, and we'll see what we can do with this. Thank you so much, Sanjeev, for coming on. I enjoy listening to you. Thank you for putting up with me as well. Some of my questions weren't questions. You handled it very well.
Thank you so much, Randall.